The alarm shriek tore through the quiet morning. The moment I stepped onto the land my grandfather left behind. 900 acres, a deep blue lake, the legacy of 60 years of one man's life. But standing in my path were two security guards in matching uniforms, hands on their radios, eyes cold as if I were the trespasser. Behind them, a 3-story mansion loomed over the bluff overlooking the lake, a structure I had never seen in any family photograph. "You're standing on private property." A woman emerged from the gate, her voice calm as though she had said this 100 times before. "I have legal documentation. You can verify it with the county planning office." She smiled, the smile of someone who knows they hold power. I looked down at the inheritance papers in my hand, then back at the mansion. Something was wrong. If you've ever had someone claim ownership of what rightfully belongs to you, let me know where you're watching from. Because what happened next changed everything I thought I understood about justice. The security guards didn't move. They stood like statues, blocking the dirt road that had been in my family for 3 generations. Behind them, the mansion gleamed white in the morning sun, its red tile roof a sharp contrast against the Texas hill country sky. I held up the inheritance documents, the ones that clearly stated I was now the legal owner of 900 acres of lakefront property. The taller guard glanced at the papers without interest. "Sir, ma'am handles all property matters," he said. "You'll need to speak with her." I asked who ma'am was. He nodded toward the woman standing at the gate, arms crossed, watching me like I was an inconvenience she'd been expecting. Her name was Victoria Ashford. She introduced herself with the practiced confidence of someone who had spent decades getting exactly what she wanted. Mid-50s, immaculately dressed, jewelry that cost more than my car, she explained, in a tone that suggested she was doing me a favor by even speaking to me. That she had purchased this portion of the property 8 years ago through a legally binding agreement with the previous owner. When I told her the previous owner was my grandfather and that he had never mentioned selling anything to anyone, she tilted her head slightly and smiled. "Perhaps he didn't tell you everything, Mr. Murphy. Families have secrets. Land deals happen. I suggest you check with the county recorder's office before making accusations you can't support." She turned and walked back through her gate, dismissing me as completely as if I had never existed. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the mansion that shouldn't exist on land that should be mine. The probate court confirmed the transfer of my grandfather's entire estate 3 weeks ago. I had the deed in my hand. Yet probate confirmation is just paperwork. It doesn't physically remove someone who has controlled the gate, hired security, and treated the property as their own for years. Without a court order or sheriff's enforcement, Victoria Ashford could stand behind that fence indefinitely, and there was nothing I could do about it in that moment except gather evidence. My grandfather, William Murphy, had owned this ranch since 1963. He died 4 months ago at the age of 87, and his will was unambiguous. Everything went to me, his only grandchild. I wasn't going to let someone take it from him just because they had money and lawyers and a gate with guards. I drove to the county recorder's office that afternoon. The clerk was polite but unhelpful, explaining that property records were public and I was welcome to search them myself. I spent 4 hours in a basement archive room, pulling files, cross-referencing parcel numbers, and building a timeline of every transaction involving my grandfather's land. I found 60 years of property tax records showing continuous Murphy family ownership, survey maps that matched the boundaries I remembered, and documentation of every minor easement and utility agreement. And then I found something that made no sense. According to the official records, a 32-acre parcel on the northeast corner of the property, the exact location where Victoria Ashford's mansion now stood, had been transferred to something called Lakeview Holdings LLC in 2016. The transfer document bore my grandfather's signature. The notarization was dated March 15th of that year. The consideration listed was $1 and other valuable consideration. a phrase that typically indicated a gift or internal family transfer rather than a market rate sale. I stared at that document for a long time. My grandfather had suffered a stroke in February of 2016. By March, he could barely hold a pen. His handwriting, which I knew as well as my own, had deteriorated into shaky, uncertain marks that looked nothing like the confident signature on this transfer document. I photographed everything: the deed, the notarization, the corporate filing for Lakeview Holdings, LLC. Then I drove to the county planning office and requested the building permits for the mansion. The clerk pulled the file and handed it to me without comment. The permits had been issued in 2017, approved by the County Planning Commission with a signature from someone named Willie Hernandez, a county official I had never dealt with, and whose name appeared nowhere in any of my grandfather's records. The applicant was listed as Lakeview Holdings, LLC. The property description matched the 32 acres that had supposedly been transferred from my grandfather. I sat in my truck in the parking lot, engine off, staring at the photographs on my phone. Someone had forged my grandfather's signature while he was recovering from a stroke. Someone had created a shell company to receive the fraudulent transfer. And someone inside the county planning office had approved building permits for a mansion on land that was never legally sold. The notary who certified that signature, the official who approved those permits, they weren't just witnesses to a crime. They might have been part of constructing it. I called my grandfather's attorney, the one who had handled the probate. He confirmed what I already suspected: there had been no mention of any transfer, no reference to Lakeview Holdings, no indication that my grandfather had ever sold or gifted any portion of the property. The will had been straightforward, the title search routine. "If there's a competing claim," he said carefully, "you'll need to challenge it through the courts. But I should warn you, Mr. Murphy, land disputes can take years and cost more than the land is worth. Are you sure you want to pursue this?" I told him I was sure. He sighed and gave me the name of an attorney who specialized in property disputes. A woman named Christine Roberts, who had a reputation for taking cases others wouldn't touch. That night, I drove back to the ranch and parked on the main road, looking down at the lake in the fading light. The mansion's windows glowed warm against the darkening sky, and I could see figures moving inside Victoria Ashford and whoever else lived in the house she had built on my grandfather's land. I thought about what the attorney had said, about years of litigation and costs that could bankrupt me. I thought about walking away, selling what remained of the property, and forgetting that any of this had ever happened. But then I thought about my grandfather, about the 60 years he had poured into this land, about the summers we had spent together, fishing and hiking and watching the sun set over the water. He had trusted me with his legacy. He had believed I would protect it. I pulled out my phone and searched for Christine Roberts. Her website described her as an attorney who specialized in complex property disputes and title fraud. Her reviews mentioned cases that seemed impossible until she won them. I sent her an email that night, attaching photographs of every document I had found, and asked if she would be willing to meet. Her response came at 11:47 that evening, a single line that would change the course of the next 18 months of my life. "I've seen this pattern before. We should talk." Something in those words told me that Victoria Ashford's mansion wasn't just built on my land. It was built on a network of forged signatures, shell companies, and cooperative officials that someone had carefully constructed to look legitimate. And I was about to find out exactly who had constructed it. Christine Roberts met me at her office in Austin 3 days later. She was younger than I expected, maybe early 40s, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense manner that made me feel like she had already read my entire case file before I walked through the door. She had. The photographs I sent, the timeline I constructed, the documents from the county recorder. She had printed everything and spread it across her conference table like pieces of a puzzle. "Your instincts are correct," she said without preamble. "This signature doesn't match the deterioration pattern you'd expect from someone recovering from a stroke. And the notarization date falls within a window when your grandfather was still in rehabilitation. But instincts aren't evidence. Mr. Murphy, we need a forensic document examiner, and we need to establish a chain of custody for every piece of paper that crosses our path. I asked her what our chances were. She leaned back in her chair and gave me the kind of honest assessment that most attorneys avoid. If this were a simple title dispute, I'd say 50-50. But Victoria Ashford isn't a simple opponent. I've heard her name before in other cases, always on the periphery. She has connections in this county: political, financial, social, the planning commission that approved her building permits. She's donated to half their campaigns. The county recorder who filed that transfer document. His office received a new computer system last year, funded by a grant from a foundation she chairs. Christine paused, letting that sink in. This isn't just about whether you can prove the signature is forged. It's about whether you can prove it in a system where she's spent years cultivating allies. The next 2 weeks taught me exactly what Christine meant. I filed a formal complaint with the county recorder's office, requesting an investigation into the authenticity of the transfer document. The response came back in 4 days, a form letter stating that the document had been reviewed and found to comply with all applicable recording standards. No investigation, no forensic analysis, just a bureaucratic dismissal that treated my complaint like a nuisance to be cleared from someone's desk. When I asked the sheriff's department to accompany me to the property so I could at least access the portions of the ranch that weren't in dispute, the deputy who called me back was apologetic but firm, without a court order establishing my right to access. They couldn't intervene in what they considered a civil matter. Every other request I filed for notary records, for planning commission meeting minutes, for correspondence related to the building permits met similar resistance. Doors that should have opened stayed firmly closed. Victoria Ashford, meanwhile, was not sitting idle. On the 12th day after I visited Christine's office, I received a certified letter from an attorney named Douglas Whitfield, representing Mrs. Ashford and Lakeview Holdings, LLC. The letter accused me of harassment, defamation, and tortious interference with property rights. It claimed that my baseless accusations had caused Mrs. Ashford significant emotional distress and reputational harm within the community. It demanded that I cease all contact with county officials regarding the property, retract any statements I had made questioning the legitimacy of her ownership, and pay $25,000 in damages. If I failed to comply within 14 days, the letter promised, Mrs. Ashford would pursue all available legal remedies, including but not limited to civil litigation and requests for restraining orders. I showed the letter to Christine. She read it twice, then set it down with a thin smile. This is what I expected. She's trying to make this expensive and uncomfortable before you can build a real case. The claims are mostly nonsense. You have a right to file complaints and request public records, but defending against a lawsuit costs money and time, even if you win. She looked at me directly. This is the moment where most people give up, Mr. Murphy. She's counting on that. The question is whether you're most people. I told her I wasn't. She nodded and pulled out a yellow legal pad. Then we need to stop playing defense and start building an offense. But we do it quietly. No more complaints to county offices where she has influence. No more requests that tip her off to what we're looking for. From now on, we gather evidence through channels she can't touch. The community response was harder to navigate than the legal threats. Victoria Ashford had lived in the area for 8 years, and in that time she had woven herself into the fabric of local society charity events, donations to the volunteer fire department, support for the church restoration fund. When word spread that someone was challenging her property rights, even people who should have known my family turned cautious. Earl Dawson, an old rancher who had been friends with my grandfather for 40 years, seemed hesitant when I visited him. He stood on his porch without inviting me inside. I don't want to get involved in whatever this is, son, he said quietly. Victoria's been good to people around here. Your grandfather's gone. Maybe it's best to let sleeping dogs lie. The words stung more than any legal threat. If Earl Dawson wouldn't stand with me, I was truly alone in this fight. I drove back to the ranch that evening and parked in my usual spot on the main road. The mansion glowed in the distance, warm and confident, as if mocking my efforts. I had filed complaints that went nowhere. I had received threats designed to drain my resources. I had watched a man who knew my grandfather for 4 decades choose silence over loyalty. Victoria Ashford hadn't just built a house on my land, she had built a fortress of influence around it, and every official, every neighbor, every institution that should have helped me was instead standing guard at her walls. But as I sat there in the fading light, something Christine had said kept nagging at me. She mentioned that Victoria's name had appeared in other cases, always on the periphery. I pulled out my phone and searched for lawsuits involving Lakeview Holdings, LLC. Most results were routine business filings, but one caught my attention, a dismissed case from 4 years ago involving a different property in a neighboring county. The plaintiff had alleged a fraudulent transfer of land from an elderly owner. The case was dismissed when the plaintiff ran out of money to continue. I looked at the corporate filing more carefully. Lakeview Holdings, LLC was formed in December of 15. The transfer document bearing my grandfather's signature was dated March 15, 2016, but according to the Texas Secretary of State's records, the company's registered agent, the person legally authorized to receive documents on behalf of the corporation, hadn't been appointed until April of 2016, a full month after the transfer supposedly occurred. That meant on the day my grandfather allegedly signed over 32 acres to Lakeview Holdings, LLC. The company wasn't legally capable of receiving property. The transfer couldn't have happened the way the documents claimed. Someone had backdated the paperwork. And that small inconsistency was the first crack I could use to bring the whole structure down. Christine's strategy was simple: stop asking permission and start gathering proof. The county had shown its hand. From now on, we would work through channels Victoria Ashford couldn't control: independent experts, state-level databases, federal records. We would build our case in silence until we had something too solid to ignore. "She thinks you're defeated," Christine said. "Let her believe that while we work in the shadows." The first expert Christine brought in was Frank Holloway, a licensed surveyor with 30 years of experience and no ties to the county. I hired him to conduct an independent survey of the entire 900 acres, with particular attention to the 32-acre parcel where Victoria's mansion stood. The cost was nearly $4,000, but Christine assured me it was essential. "Boundaries are facts," she said, "and facts don't care about political donations." Frank spent 3 days on the property, working from the public road and adjacent parcels where Victoria's security couldn't legally stop him. When he delivered his report, the implications were immediate. The boundaries described in the transfer document didn't match the actual location of Victoria's mansion. The legal description placed the parcel approximately 200 feet to the east of where the house actually sat. The mansion's foundation, the private dock, the landscaped grounds, all of it extended beyond the boundaries of whatever land the document claimed to convey. "Either the legal description is wrong," Frank explained, pointing to his maps, "or the house was deliberately built in the wrong location. Either way, there's a significant encroachment onto adjacent land." This wasn't just about disputed ownership anymore. Even if Victoria's claim had been legitimate, her mansion was physically sitting on ground that was never part of any transfer. Someone had gotten sloppy or assumed nobody would ever measure. Christine used the survey findings as a starting point to examine the chain of title through the Texas General Land Office, which maintained archives independent of county control. The contrast was stark. County records showed a transfer to Lakeview Holdings, LLC in 2016. State master records showed no corresponding conveyance. My grandfather's ownership ran unbroken from 1963 until his death. The county filing existed, but it had never been properly recorded at the state level, as if someone had created a local document and assumed nobody would verify it against the primary database. That assumption pointed directly at Willie Hernandez. Christine pulled his financial disclosures, and the picture emerged quickly. His real estate development company had gone bankrupt in 2014. 2 years later, he was appointed to the County Planning Commission. 2 years after that, he signed off on construction permits for Victoria Ashford's mansion permits for a structure built on land that was never legally transferred. The campaign contributions connecting him to Lakeview Holdings LLC's registered agent only tightened the knot. Victoria Ashford wasn't just a wealthy woman who had bought some land. She was the center of a network that included a compromised official, a shell company, and a method for acquiring property through paperwork that looked legitimate on the surface but fell apart under scrutiny. While Christine built the legal framework, I searched for witnesses. Most of my grandfather's old friends wouldn't speak to me, but one name kept appearing in his address book: Harold Becker, a former ranch hand who had retired 50 miles away. I drove out without calling ahead. Harold was 81, frail but sharp-eyed, and when I explained what had happened to the ranch, his reaction surprised me. "I always knew something wasn't right about that woman," he said, settling into a chair on his porch. "She showed up about 8 years ago, started asking questions around town about your grandfather's property, who owned what, where the boundaries were, and whether the old man had any family who might come looking. People thought she was just interested in buying lakefront land, but she wasn't buying. She was planning." I asked if he knew anything specific. Harold was quiet for a long moment. "Your grandfather called me, maybe 6 months before he died. He was confused, upset, said someone had been to his house with papers to sign, and he couldn't remember if he'd signed them or not. Asked me to come check on him, but I was in the hospital myself. By the time I got out, he'd had another stroke." Harold looked at me with something like guilt in his eyes. "I should have done more. I should have called someone. But I didn't think anyone would try to steal land from a dying man." I recorded his statement with permission, then drove back to Austin. Christine listened twice, taking notes, her expression sharpening with each detail. "This is good," she said. "We have a survey showing encroachment beyond any claimed boundaries. We have state records that contradict the county filing. We have financial connections between Ashford and a planning commissioner. And now we have a witness who can testify she was gathering information about your grandfather's property before any transfer supposedly occurred." She set down her pen. "We have enough to file a formal complaint with the Texas Attorney General's office for real estate fraud. Once we do that, this stops being a local dispute. It becomes a state investigation." I asked when we should file. She checked her calendar. "Give me 1 more week to verify the financial connections. Then we go on the offensive." I nodded, feeling something I hadn't felt in weeks: hope. But as I drove home that night, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It contained a single photograph my truck parked outside Harold Becker's house, taken from somewhere across the road. Below it, 3 words: "We're watching you." The surveillance photo was just the beginning. Within 48 hours of my visit to Harold Becker, Victoria Ashford launched a campaign designed to destroy me before I could destroy her. It started with a story in the local newspaper, a small weekly that covered county politics and community events. The headline read, "Out-of-state heir harasses beloved local philanthropist over land dispute." The article painted Victoria as a victim of my aggressive and legally questionable tactics, quoting unnamed sources who described me as obsessive and potentially unstable. See, it mentioned that I had been contacting elderly residents and pressuring them to make statements. It failed to mention that the land in question had belonged to my family for 60 years, or that my grandfather's signature on the transfer document was almost certainly forged. Within days, the story had spread across community message boards, spawning comments that called me a greedy outsider and suggested I should be investigated for elder abuse. Christine called me the morning the article appeared. "Don't respond publicly," she said. "That's what she wants. We stay focused on the evidence. I agreed, but staying silent became harder when the attacks reached my professional life. I worked remotely as a software consultant, and one contract I had been negotiating with a company in Austin suddenly went cold. When I finally reached the project manager by phone, he was evasive. "We've decided to go in a different direction," he said. There was a long pause. "Nothing personal, Mr. Murphy. Good luck with your situation." I never found out exactly what was said, but the timing was impossible to ignore. Victoria Ashford wasn't just attacking my reputation in the community. She was reaching into my livelihood. The hardest blow came 3 days later. Earl Dawson called me with a voice heavy with regret. "I got a visit today," he said. "Two men in suits, attorneys representing Mrs. Ashford. They told me that if I provided any assistance to your case testimony, documents, anything, they would file a lawsuit against me for defamation and tortious interference." He paused, and I could hear the weight of decades in his silence. "I'm 73 years old, Stephen. I don't have the money to fight lawyers. I don't have the years left to spend in courtrooms." I told him I understood. He apologized 3 times before hanging up. That night, I sat alone in my rental apartment and wondered if Victoria Ashford had already won. The settlement offer arrived 2 days later, delivered by Douglas Whitfield himself. He appeared at my door without warning, a leather briefcase in one hand and a manila envelope in the other. His manner was cordial, almost friendly, as if we were old acquaintances meeting for coffee rather than adversaries in a legal battle. "Mr. Murphy, my client has authorized me to present a settlement proposal," he said, handing me the envelope. "Mrs. Ashford recognizes that this dispute has caused stress for both parties. She's prepared to offer you $150,000 in exchange for a full release of all claims, a confidentiality agreement, and your agreement to cease all contact with county officials, media outlets, and potential witnesses regarding this matter." He smiled. "That's a generous sum for someone in your position. I'd encourage you to consider it carefully." I read the document slowly while Whitfield waited. $150,000. Enough to pay off debts, start over somewhere else, forget that any of this had ever happened. The number sat there on the page, patient and tempting, offering an exit from a fight that was costing me everything. I thought about Harold Becker, 81 years old, now a target for legal harassment because he had told me the truth about a woman who had been planning to steal my grandfather's land for years. I thought about my grandfather lying in a hospital bed after his stroke, confused and vulnerable, while someone placed papers in front of him and guided his hand to sign away 60 years of his life's work. Victoria Ashford wasn't offering me money. She was offering me the chance to become complicit in what she had done to take her silence payment and let her do this again to someone else's family. I handed the envelope back to Whitfield. "No." He blinked, his composure slipping for just a moment. "Mr. Murphy, I strongly advise you to reconsider. Mrs. Ashford's patience has limits, and the legal resources at her disposal are considerable. If you refuse this offer, she will pursue every available remedy, and I assure you the outcome will be far less favorable than what you're holding in your hand right now." I opened my front door and stepped aside. "Tell Mrs. Ashford that my grandfather's land isn't for sale. It never was." Whitfield's expression hardened. He tucked the envelope back into his briefcase and walked past me without another word. I closed the door behind him and leaned against it, my heart pounding. I had just turned down more money than I had ever seen in my life. I had just declared war on a woman with unlimited resources and no conscience. Christine called that evening to check in. I told her about Whitfield's visit and my refusal of the settlement. She was quiet for a moment. "That took courage, but you should know things are going to get worse before they get better. She'll escalate now. She has to." I asked if there was any good news. Christine's voice shifted, something cautious entering her tone. "Actually, There might be. I received a call this afternoon from a journalist named Andrea Clark. She works for a state-level investigative outlet and has been looking into county planning irregularities for months. She came across Victoria Ashford's name independently and wants to know more about your case. I asked if we could trust her. Christine paused. I don't know yet, but she has resources we don't access to government sources, a platform that reaches beyond this county, and the ability to ask questions that officials have to answer on the record. If she's legitimate, she could change everything. She gave me Andrea's number. Call her tomorrow, but be careful what you share until we know whose side she's really on. I stared at the number on my phone. Somewhere out there, someone else had noticed that something was wrong in this county. Someone with the tools to dig deeper than I ever could. Victoria Ashford had spent 8 years building a network of influence and protection, but networks have weak points, and journalists are trained to find them. For the first time since that surveillance photo arrived, the darkness felt a little less complete. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was about to go on the offensive. Andrea Clark was not what I expected. She was younger than Christine, maybe mid-30s, with the kind of focused intensity that suggested she had spent years chasing stories that other journalists avoided. We met at a coffee shop in Austin, a neutral ground where neither of us would feel cornered. She arrived with a laptop bag over her shoulder and a notepad already open. Pen ready. Before I could introduce myself properly, she slid a folder across the table. I've been investigating Willie Hernandez for 6 months, she said. Your case isn't the first time his name has appeared in connection with questionable land transfers, but it might be the one that finally brings him down. The folder contained documents I had never seen. Planning Commission meeting minutes from 2016 showing that Hernandez had recused himself from 3 separate votes involving properties adjacent to my grandfather's land, but had not recused himself from the vote approving Victoria Ashford's building permits. Financial records showing payments from a company called Horizon Development Partners to a consulting firm that shared an address with Hernandez's personal accountant. And most damaging of all, an affidavit from a former county clerk who had resigned in 2018 after refusing to process what she called obviously irregular property transfers. In her statement, she named both Willie Hernandez and Victoria Ashford as participants in a pattern of fraudulent land acquisitions targeting elderly property owners. I read the affidavit 3 times. How did you get this? Andrea's expression was careful. Sources. The former clerk reached out to me after she saw my earlier reporting on Planning Commission irregularities. She's been waiting for someone to listen. I asked why she hadn't gone public before now. Andrea shook her head. She tried, filed a complaint with the County Ethics Board in 2019. It was dismissed for insufficient evidence. The board's chairman at the time was appointed by the same county commissioner who recommended Hernandez for the Planning Commission. She paused. These people protect each other. That's why individual complaints disappear. But when you start connecting the cases, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Christine had joined us by this point, reviewing the documents with methodical attention. She pointed to a detail in the financial records of payment dated March 10th, 2016, 5 days before my grandfather allegedly signed the transfer document. The payment was listed as a consulting fee from Horizon Development Partners to the same accounting firm connected to Hernandez. The amount was exactly $12,500. That's not a coincidence, Christine said. That's a transaction. Andrea nodded. I traced Horizon Development Partners through state corporate filings. It's a shell company, registered in Delaware, with no physical office and no employees. But its registered agent is the same person who was appointed to Lakeview Holdings LLC, the company that supposedly received your grandfather's property. Andrea leaned forward. There's one more thing. I obtained the notary log for March 2016 through a public records request at the state level, not the county. The notary who certified your grandfather's signature on the transfer document logged 4 other certifications on the same day, all involving properties that were later transferred to shell companies connected to Victoria Ashford. She slid another document across the table. 3 of those property owners are now deceased. The 4th is in a memory care facility and has been declared legally incompetent. I stared at the notary log. The names and dates laid out in neat columns. 5 elderly landowners, 5 transfers on the same day, 1 notary, 1 network of shell companies, 1 planning commissioner approved every building permit, and at the center of it all, Victoria Ashford, who had spent years stealing land from people who couldn't defend themselves while county officials looked the other way or actively helped. The evidence wasn't circumstantial anymore. It was a blueprint. Christine broke the silence. This is enough. The affidavit, the financial records, the notary log, the pattern of similar transfers. We have grounds to file a complaint not just for real estate fraud, but for conspiracy, elder abuse, and public corruption. She looked at Andrea. Are you planning to publish? Andrea nodded. I'm working on a piece that covers the broader pattern, but I want to coordinate timing with your legal filing. If the story breaks before you're ready, it gives them time to destroy evidence or intimidate witnesses. If we move together, they won't have time to react. Christine turned to me. Mr. Murphy, once we file with the Attorney General and Andrea publishes her investigation, there's no going back. Victoria Ashford will know exactly what we have. She'll either surrender or fight with everything she has. Are you ready for that? I thought about my grandfather, who had spent 60 years building something on that land, trusting that his legacy would be protected. I thought about the former clerk who had tried to blow the whistle and been silenced by the very system she had served. I thought about the other families who had lost land to forged signatures while they grieved or struggled with illness, never knowing what had been taken from them. Victoria Ashford had counted on silence. She had counted on isolation. She had counted on the weight of her money crushing anyone who dared to challenge her. But she hadn't counted on a journalist who wouldn't stop digging, a lawyer who specialized in impossible cases, and a grandson who refused to walk away. File it, I said. File everything. Christine nodded and began organizing the documents. Andrea closed her laptop and stood to leave. I'll have the story ready within a week, she said. Once it goes live, make sure you're somewhere safe. People like Victoria Ashford don't lose gracefully. She paused at the door. And Mr. Murphy, thank you. Your grandfather's case is going to help a lot of other families who never knew what happened to their land. I watched her leave, then turned back to Christine. What happens now? She gathered the last of the papers into her briefcase. Now, we wait for the Attorney General's office to acknowledge receipt. Then we wait for them to open an investigation. Then we wait for Victoria Ashford to make her next move. She met my eyes. She's going to come at you harder than ever. Everything she's done so far was her trying to make this go away quietly. Once she realizes quiet isn't an option anymore, she'll get loud. Be ready. I drove home that night with copies of every document locked in my trunk. The evidence was overwhelming. The pattern was undeniable. For the first time since I had discovered a mansion on my grandfather's land, I had something more powerful than Victoria Ashford's money and connections, the truth, documented and verified, ready to be presented to people she couldn't buy. But as I pulled into my apartment complex, I noticed a black sedan parked across the street, engine running, windows tinted too dark to see inside. It hadn't been there when I left that morning. I went inside, locked the door, and checked every window. Christine was right. Victoria Ashford was about to get loud. Christine filed the complaint with the Texas Attorney General's office on a Tuesday morning. By Wednesday afternoon, Victoria Ashford's legal team had responded with a lawsuit naming me, Christine, and Andrea Clark as defendants in a civil action for defamation, tortious interference, and conspiracy to damage Mrs. Ashford's business interests. The damages sought totaled $2.3 million. Douglas Whitfield held a press conference outside the county courthouse, calling our complaint a coordinated smear campaign orchestrated by a disgruntled heir and his accomplices. He described Victoria as a pillar of this community who had been victimized by baseless accusations. The local news covered it extensively. The state media picked it up within hours. Christine called me that evening. "This is exactly what we wanted," she said. "She's panicking. A defamation lawsuit means discovery. And discovery means we get to subpoena documents she's been hiding for years. Her lawyers just handed us the keys to her filing cabinet." I asked what that meant practically. Depositions? Financial records? We get to put Victoria Ashford under oath and ask her questions she can't refuse to answer. They get to do the same to us, but we have nothing to hide. She has everything to hide. That asymmetry is our advantage. The next 3 weeks were consumed by legal maneuvering. Victoria's team tried to get our complaint dismissed, arguing I lacked standing to challenge a property transfer recorded 8 years earlier. The Attorney General's office rejected the motion, noting that allegations of fraud and forgery told the statute of limitations, meaning the clock hadn't started running until I discovered the fraud, not when it occurred. Other motions followed, each designed to delay or derail, and each denied. Victoria's attorneys filed for a change of venue, claiming local media coverage had prejudiced the case. Denied. They sought to seal all depositions from public record. Denied. By the time depositions began in early November, Victoria had exhausted her procedural options. Willie Hernandez appeared on the 4th day, accompanied by his own attorney, a sign that he was preparing to distance himself from Victoria if necessary. Christine questioned him for 6 hours. I watched through a video feed from an adjacent room, taking notes, tracking every hesitation and contradiction. For the first 3 hours, Hernandez was careful, answering questions about his role on the Planning Commission with bureaucratic precision. He confirmed that he had approved building permits for Victoria's mansion. He confirmed that he had reviewed the property documentation. He confirmed that he had found everything to be in order. His voice was steady, his posture relaxed. He thought he was winning. Christine let him build his wall of denials, brick by careful brick, waiting for the right moment to bring it down. The key moment came in hour 4. Christine produced the notary log showing 5 certifications on the same day, all involving properties later transferred to shell companies connected to Victoria Ashford. She asked if Hernandez had been aware of this pattern when he approved the permits. His attorney objected, arguing the question was outside the scope of the deposition. The objection was overruled. Hernandez shifted in his chair, glanced at his lawyer, and said he did not know any pattern. His voice had lost its steadiness. Christine then produced the financial records, the $12,500 payment from Horizon Development Partners to the accounting firm connected to Hernandez, dated 5 days before my grandfather's signature appeared on the transfer document. She laid the document on the table between them and let the silence stretch. "Mr. Hernandez?" Christine said, her voice steady. "Can you explain why a shell company controlled by Victoria Ashford paid your accountant $12,500 less than a week before you approved building permits for a mansion built on fraudulently transferred land?" Hernandez's face went pale. His attorney called for a recess immediately. They were gone for 20 minutes. When they returned, Hernandez's demeanor had changed completely, shoulders hunched, eyes avoiding the camera. He invoked his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination and refused to answer any further questions related to financial transactions or his relationship with Victoria Ashford. Christine noted for the record that his invocation of the Fifth could be used as evidence of consciousness of guilt in the civil proceedings. The deposition ended, but Willie Hernandez had just confirmed, through his silence, that he had something to hide. And everyone in that room knew it. Andrea's story broke 3 days later. The headline read, "Pattern of Fraud: How a County Official and a Wealthy Developer Allegedly Stole Land from Elderly Texans." The article detailed everything: the forged signatures, the shell companies, the notary log, the financial connections, the 5 victims, including my grandfather, the former county clerk's affidavit, and Hernandez's invocation of the Fifth Amendment. It included photographs of Victoria's mansion, satellite images showing its location on my grandfather's property, and a timeline of the fraudulent transfers stretching back nearly a decade. Victoria's attorneys issued a statement calling the allegations defamatory and without merit. But within 48 hours, the story had been picked up by 3 national outlets. Victoria Ashford's name was becoming infamous across the state. The Attorney General's office responded within a week, upgrading their investigation from preliminary to active and assigning a dedicated team to examine all 5 transfers identified in Andrea's reporting. County commissioners who had accepted Victoria's campaign contributions issued statements distancing themselves from her. The county recorder announced an internal review of property transfers processed during the period in question. But none of that mattered as much as the AG's decision. Once state investigators started subpoenaing bank records and interviewing witnesses under oath, Victoria's network would begin to unravel. People who had stayed quiet when they thought she had power would start talking when they realized she was going down. Victoria's response came 2 days later, but not in the form I expected. Instead of another legal motion or press conference, she requested a meeting, just her, me, and our attorneys. No press, no recording devices. Douglas Whitfield called Christine directly to arrange it. "Mrs. Ashford believes this matter has escalated beyond what either party intended," he said. "She's prepared to discuss a resolution that addresses Mr. Murphy's concerns while preserving her privacy and reputation." Christine asked what kind of resolution. Whitfield was vague. "That would depend on the conversation. But I can tell you that Mrs. Ashford is prepared to be flexible." Christine relayed the offer that evening. "It could be another attempt to buy your silence, or it could be genuine desperation. Either way, we should take the meeting. If she admits anything, even in a private setting, it strengthens our case." I agreed, but the timing bothered me. Victoria had spent months attacking through every available channel the lawsuit, the press conference, the witness intimidation, the surveillance. Now she wanted to talk. Christine must have seen the doubt on my face. "The AG investigation changed everything. This isn't a county matter anymore. She can't control what happens next. For the first time in 8 years, Victoria Ashford is facing consequences she can't buy or threaten her way out of." She checked her calendar. "The meeting is set for Friday at 10. The judge has scheduled a preliminary hearing for Monday. That's when the court decides whether to grant our motion compelling Victoria to testify under oath about the property transfers." She looked at me with the calm certainty of someone who had been waiting for this moment. Whatever she's planning to offer on Friday, she knows Monday is coming, and Monday is when she loses control completely. The Friday meeting took place in a conference room at Douglas Whitfield's law firm, a sterile space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Austin. Victoria Ashford was already seated when Christine and I arrived, her posture rigid, her expression carefully neutral. She looked older than I remembered from our first encounter at the gate. The weeks of mounting pressure had carved lines into her face that makeup couldn't quite hide. Whitfield sat beside her, a stack of documents in front of him. On our side of the table, Christine arranged her own files with methodical precision. No one spoke until the door closed. Victoria broke the silence first. "Mr. Murphy, I want to begin by acknowledging that this situation has caused unnecessary pain for both of us." Her voice was measured, rehearsed. "I believe there may have been misunderstandings on both sides, and I'm here today to explore whether we can find a resolution that serves everyone's interests." I waited. Christine had advised me to let Victoria talk, to see what she would reveal when she thought she was in control. Victoria continued, "I'm prepared to offer you full ownership of the disputed 32 acres. including the structures currently on the property. I'm also prepared to compensate you for any legal expenses you've incurred, up to $100,000. In exchange, I would ask that you withdraw your complaint with the Attorney General's office and agree to a mutual non-disclosure regarding the terms of our settlement. Christine leaned forward. Mrs. Ashford, you're offering to return property that was never legally yours to begin with, and you're asking my client to help you avoid a criminal investigation. That's not a settlement. That's obstruction of justice. Victoria's composure flickered. I'm offering a practical solution to a complicated situation. The legal process could take years. Mr. Murphy could spend everything he has fighting a battle that ends with the same result I'm offering him today. She turned to me directly. Stephen, may I call you Stephen? I understand you want to honor your grandfather's memory. I respect that. But William Murphy was a practical man. He would have wanted you to take the sure thing rather than gamble everything on a courtroom verdict. The mention of my grandfather's name from her lips sent a cold wave through my chest. You didn't know my grandfather, I said. You forged his signature while he was recovering from a stroke. You stole his land while he was dying. Don't pretend you have any idea what he would have wanted. Victoria's mask slipped for just a moment, a flash of something hard and calculating behind her eyes, before she recovered. I can see emotions are running high. Perhaps we should take a break. Christine shook her head. There's nothing to reflect on. My client wants his family's land restored, accountability for the fraud committed against his grandfather, and justice for the other victims. Your offer addresses none of those concerns. Victoria stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. Then I suppose we'll see each other on Monday, Mr. Murphy. But I want you to understand something. She leaned forward, her voice dropping. I have resources you cannot imagine. I have relationships in this state that go back decades. Whatever happens in that courtroom, this isn't over. It will never be over until I decide it's over. Whitfield touched her arm. A warning gesture, but she shook him off. You think you've won something because a journalist wrote a story and some politicians issued press releases? You have no idea how power works in this state. Monday is just the beginning. She gathered her purse and walked out. Whitfield followed, pausing at the door to give Christine a look that might have been an apology or warning. The door closed behind them. Christine exhaled slowly. She's scared. Really scared. Everything she just said, the threats, the posturing, that's not the language of someone who thinks they're going to win. That's the language of someone who knows they're about to lose. She began packing her files. Monday is going to be interesting. Monday arrived with the weight of everything that had led to it. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 10 in the morning at the county courthouse, the same building where Victoria had filed her defamation lawsuit, the same institution that had protected her for 8 years. But today would be different. Today, Judge Patricia Hendricks will decide whether to grant our motion compelling Victoria to testify under oath. And today, for the first time, the evidence would enter the public record where Victoria's money and connections couldn't make it disappear. The courtroom was packed. Andrea Clark sat in the press section with 2 other journalists. Earl Dawson had come despite the threats against him. Sitting in the back row, Harold Becker was there too, frail but determined. I saw faces from the community people who had called me a greedy outsider, now here to see the evidence for themselves. Victoria sat at the defendant's table with Whitfield and 2 other attorneys. Willie Hernandez was notably absent. Judge Hendricks called the proceedings to order and asked Christine to present our motion. Christine walked the court through the evidence efficiently, each piece now a matter of public record. The independent survey confirmed the mansion extended 200 feet beyond any boundary in the disputed transfer physical proof of encroachment that no document could explain away. The Texas General Land Office records showed no valid transfer had ever been recorded at the state level. The county filing existed in isolation. disconnected from the master chain of title. The financial records established payments from Victoria's shell companies to accounts connected to Willie Hernandez, timed precisely with permit approvals. And the notary log documented 5 certifications on the same day, all involving elderly property owners. 3 now deceased, a pattern that could not be a coincidence. Whitfield rose to respond, dismissing the evidence as circumstantial and the witnesses as unreliable. He argued that business relationships were being mischaracterized as corruption, that timing coincidences were being treated as proof of conspiracy, and that his client was the victim of a coordinated attack by competitors and opportunists. He spoke for 45 minutes, but his arguments felt hollow against the weight of the documentation Christine had presented. When he finished, he asked the judge to deny our motion and dismiss the case entirely. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Hendricks reviewed her notes. Then she looked at Victoria. "Mrs. Ashford, before I rule on this motion, I'm going to allow you to address the court directly. You are not required to speak, and anything you say can be used in subsequent proceedings. Do you wish to make a statement?" Whitfield leaned over and whispered something urgent in Victoria's ear. She brushed him aside and stood, smoothing her jacket. "Your Honor, I appreciate the opportunity to speak." What happened next would be replayed in local news coverage for weeks. Victoria began calmly, reiterating her innocence, expressing confidence that the legal process would vindicate her. But as she spoke, something shifted. The pressure of months of investigation, the exposure of her network, the presence of journalists and former victims, it cracked something inside her carefully constructed facade. She started talking about the sacrifices she had made to build her business, about the difficult decisions required to succeed in a competitive market. She complained about the unfairness of being targeted when everyone in real estate used similar methods. And then, in a moment that made Christine grip my arm, she said something that changed everything. "The Hernandez arrangement was standard practice," Victoria said, her voice rising with indignation. "Every developer in this county has similar relationships with planning officials. The only difference is that I'm being prosecuted for it while they continue operating without scrutiny. If you want to investigate fraud, investigate the entire system, not just the one person who had the misfortune of being targeted by a vindictive heir and a publicity-seeking journalist." The courtroom erupted. Whitfield was on his feet immediately, trying to interrupt, but Victoria kept talking, her composure completely gone. "Willie Hernandez didn't do anything that a dozen other commissioners haven't done. The payments were consulting fees, completely legal, documented through proper channels. The fact that they coincided with permit approvals is how business works in this state. Anyone who pretends otherwise is either naive or lying." Judge Hendricks banged her gavel for order. "Mrs. Ashford, I strongly advise you to stop speaking and consult with your attorney." But the damage was done. Victoria had just admitted, in open court, on the record, that she had made payments to Willie Hernandez that coincided with permit approvals. She had called it standard practice and how business works. She had confirmed the existence of an arrangement that she had previously denied entirely. Christine was already writing notes. Andrea Clark had her phone out, recording. The other journalists were doing the same. Whitfield finally managed to guide Victoria back to her seat, his face ashen. He requested an immediate recess, which Judge Hendricks granted. As the courtroom emptied, I saw Victoria's son, Kyle Ashford, standing near the back exit. Late 20s, expensive suit, watching his mother with an expression of disbelief. Our eyes met briefly. He shook his head slowly, then turned and walked out. When the court reconvened 30 minutes later, the atmosphere had changed completely. Judge Hendricks announced that she was granting our motion to compel Victoria's testimony under oath. She also announced that she was referring the transcript of today's proceedings to the Attorney General's office for review of potential criminal admissions. And she ordered Victoria Ashford to surrender her passport pending the outcome of the state investigation, citing her statements as evidence of possible flight risk. Whitfield objected to each ruling, but his voice had lost its conviction. Victoria sat motionless, staring straight ahead, as if she couldn't quite process what had just happened. As we left the courthouse, Andrea Clark caught up with us on the steps. "That was the most remarkable self-destruction I've ever witnessed in a courtroom," she said. "She just confirmed everything we alleged, on the record, in front of a judge and half a dozen journalists." I asked her what would happen next. Andrea glanced back at the courthouse doors. "The AG's office will have to act now." She admitted to paying a public official in connection with permit approvals. That's bribery. Combined with the forgery evidence and the pattern of fraudulent transfers, she's looking at multiple felony charges. She paused. But here's the thing, she also implicated the entire system. Everyone in real estate uses similar methods. A dozen other commissioners. If the AG takes that seriously, this could become much bigger than one woman and one piece of land. Christine joined us, her expression a mixture of satisfaction and caution. "Today was a victory," she said. "But it's not over. Victoria still has resources, and desperate people do desperate things. The criminal case will take months, possibly years. The civil case to restore your property could take just as long." She looked at me directly. "Are you prepared for that?" I thought about my grandfather, about the 60 years he had poured into that land, about the other families who had lost their property to the same scheme. I thought about Victoria's face as she realized what she had done, the moment when her own words became the evidence that would destroy her. "I'm prepared," I said. "However long it takes." Christine nodded. "Then let's talk about what comes next. The judge's ruling today means Victoria has to testify under oath within 30 days. The AG's office will likely file charges before that happens. And once they do, Willie Hernandez and anyone else involved in this scheme will have a choice: cooperate and testify against Victoria, or go down with her." She checked her phone. "I just got a message from the AG's office. They want to meet tomorrow to discuss the timeline for criminal proceedings." She looked at me with something approaching a smile. Monday was when Victoria lost control. But the real question is what she'll do now that she has nothing left to lose. The demolition of Victoria Ashford's mansion took place on a clear morning in early June. I stood at the edge of the property with Christine, watching as the heavy machinery moved into position. The white walls that had gleamed so confidently a year ago now looked hollow, stripped of everything that had made them seem permanent. The private dock had already been dismantled. The landscaping had been torn up. All that remained was the structure itself, 3 stories of illegal construction built on stolen land, about to become rubble. The demolition crew chief approached me before they began. "Mr. Murphy, as the property owner, you have the right to give the final order," he said. "Whenever you're ready." I looked at the mansion one last time, thinking about everything it represented. For a moment, I felt the temptation to savor this, to watch with satisfaction as every brick and beam came crashing down. But my grandfather hadn't been a man who celebrated the downfall of others, even when they deserved it. He had been a man who looked forward, not back. I turned to the crew chief. "Go ahead," I said, "but I don't need to watch." I walked away as the first walls came down, the sound of destruction fading behind me as I made my way toward the lake. The decision about what to do with the recovered land had been weighing on me for months. Christine had presented several options: sell the 32 acres to a developer, lease it for commercial use, or incorporate it back into the ranch, undeveloped. Each option had financial merit. But the land had been stolen from elderly people who couldn't defend themselves. It had been acquired through fraud that infected an entire county government. Profiting from its recovery, even legitimately, seemed like the wrong ending to this story. I made my decision 3 weeks after the demolition, standing on the cleared ground where Victoria's mansion had once stood. The foundation had been removed, the debris hauled away, the earth graded smooth. I called Christine that afternoon. "Are you sure?" she asked. "That land is worth over $1 million. I told her I was sure. The William Murphy Memorial Conservation Easement was established in late summer, permanently protecting the 32 acres from development. The land would remain open space in perpetuity, accessible to the public for hiking, fishing, and enjoying the lake. A small plaque near the shore would tell the story not of Victoria Ashford's fraud, but of my grandfather's 6 decades of stewardship. The remaining 868 acres would stay in my family, managed according to the principles he had taught me. I wasn't giving away what he had built. I was honoring what he had believed. Andrea Clark wrote one final article about the case, focusing on the conservation easement. The response surprised me. People wrote from across the state about their own experiences with land fraud, their own struggles to protect family legacies. One letter stayed with me from a woman in East Texas whose father had lost 40 acres to a similar scheme years before anyone investigated. "I always wondered if fighting would have made a difference," she wrote. "Now I know it can." I read every message. The conversations that followed taught me that the end of a legal battle is never really the end. It's the beginning of a different kind of responsibility. Kyle Ashford reached out to me 6 months after his mother began serving her sentence. His email was brief and formal, requesting a meeting. We met at a coffee shop in Austin. He looked different than he had in the courtroom, older, more worn, stripped of the privilege that had once seemed to define him. "I want to apologize," he said. "Not on behalf of my mother, she made her choices, and she's paying for them, but on behalf of myself. I knew something was wrong with how she acquired that property. I chose not to ask questions because the answers would have been inconvenient." He paused. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just needed you to know that not everyone in my family is proud of what she did." I didn't forgive him, that wasn't mine to give, but I understood him. We are all shaped by the choices of the people who came before us. What matters is what we do when we finally see those choices clearly. The lake is beautiful in autumn, when the trees along the shore turn gold and red, and the water reflects the changing sky. I go there often now, sometimes to fish, sometimes just to sit. My grandfather's land stretches out around me, protected and preserved. If you've ever fought for something that mattered, if you've ever faced down power with nothing but evidence and patience, I hope this story has meant something to you. Sometimes, the greatest victory isn't what you take from those who wronged you. It's what you choose to give back.